The morning sun peeked through the curtains, filling the kitchen with a soft glow. James stood by the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. Martha walked in, tightening the belt of her silk robe. "Something smells good," she said, her voice cheerful as she headed straight for the coffee pot. James turned, a smile spreading across his face. "Only the best for our special day," he replied, sliding a stack of pancakes onto a plate. He carried it over to the table, where he had already set out fresh berries and syrup. Martha hesitated for a split second before joining him at the table. She took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth. "You really went all out this morning," she remarked, picking up her fork. 28 years deserves a celebration, don't you think?" James said, his eyes gleaming with affection. He reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Martha's smile wavered briefly. She pulled her hand back to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "About that," she began, her gaze dropping to her plate. "I wanted to talk to you." James's brow furrowed slightly. "Is everything okay?" "There's a work conference that just came up," Martha explained, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee mug. "It's important, and I have to attend." "I'm really sorry, James. I know we had plans tonight." A moment of silence hung between them. James's shoulders sagged a little, but he forced a reassuring smile. "I understand, work can be unpredictable." "I promise I'll make it up to you," Martha added quickly, reaching for his hand this time. "We'll have our own special night when I get back." James squeezed her hand gently. "As long as you're happy and safe, that's all that matters." Relief washed over Martha's face. She leaned in and kissed his cheek softly. "Thank you for understanding." James watched her as she resumed eating, noticing the way she avoided his gaze. A hint of doubt crept into his mind, but he pushed it aside. She stood up, gathering her plate and mug. "I should get dressed." James nodded, watching her retreat upstairs. He sat alone at the table for a few moments, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Something didn't feel right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Upstairs, Martha closed the bedroom door behind her and exhaled deeply. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table and typed out a quick message. "Everything's set. See you tonight." A few seconds later, her phone buzzed with a reply. "Can't wait, babe. I've booked the room. It's going to be unforgettable." A small smile played on Martha's lips as she began selecting outfits from her closet, tossing them onto the bed. She moved with a sense of urgency, her mind already miles away. Downstairs, James cleared the table and washed the dishes, his thoughts lingering on Martha's sudden trip. He dried his hands and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his calendar. An idea struck him, and he dialed a number. "Hey, Sarah, it's James," he said when the line connected. "Do you have any plans tonight?" "Martha has to go out of town for work, and I was thinking we could catch up." Sarah's voice came through, cheerful and surprised. "Oh, hi, James. Actually, I'm free tonight. Dinner sounds great." "Perfect. Let's meet at that Italian place you love," James suggested, feeling a bit better at the prospect of company. "Sounds like a plan." "See you at 7, Sarah agreed before hanging up. James slipped his phone back into his pocket, a small smile forming as he thought about spending time with his sister-in-law. They had always gotten along well, and maybe a friendly dinner would take his mind off the disappointment. A little bit later, Martha descended the stairs, a small suitcase trailing behind her. She wore a crisp blouse and tailored pants, exuding professional confidence. James met her at the bottom of the stairs, taking the suitcase from her hand. "Let me help you with that." "Thanks," Martha said, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. "I should get going if I want to beat the traffic." James walked her out to the car, placing the suitcase in the trunk. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Call me when you get there, okay?" "I will," she promised, giving him another quick kiss. "Don't miss me too much." "I always miss you," James replied with a chuckle, stepping back as she got into the driver's seat. Martha waved as she pulled out of the driveway, watching James grow smaller in the rearview mirror. As soon as she turned the corner, she let out a sigh of relief and reached for her phone, dialing a familiar number. "On my way," she said when the call connected, her voice filled with excitement. "Can't wait to see you," Michael's voice responded warmly. Martha hung up, a grin spreading across her face as she merged onto the highway, leaving her suburban life behind for the promise of passion and escape. Back at home, James stood on the porch for a while, gazing down the street long after Martha's car had disappeared. A subtle unease lingered in his chest, but he shook it off and headed back inside, already planning the evening ahead. Martha spent the morning at her desk, but her mind was miles away. She stared at the computer screen, pretending to type while her thoughts danced around the evening ahead. The usual office chatter buzzed around her, but she barely noticed. She kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes. Around midday, she picked up her phone and sent a quick message to her boss. "There's a conference I need to attend out of town. I'll have to leave early today," she typed. Her fingers hovered over the send button for a moment before she hit it. A lie, but one that came easily. "Of course, Martha. You're always on top of things. Safe travels," came the reply. She smiled to herself, feeling a surge of excitement. No one doubted her. Why would they? She had built a reputation as a reliable and trustworthy employee. There was no reason for anyone to question her sudden departure. As the afternoon wore on, Martha packed up her desk. She moved slowly, taking her time, savoring the anticipation that built with each passing minute. Finally, when the clock hit 3, she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. "Leaving early today, Martha?" a colleague asked, passing her in the hallway. "Yes, a last-minute conference," she replied smoothly, flashing a quick smile. "Have a great trip," the colleague called after her. "Thanks, see you Monday," Martha responded, her heart racing as she stepped into the elevator. She pressed the button for the parking garage and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She was really doing this. In the car, she checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, smoothing down her hair and applying a fresh coat of lipstick. She wanted everything to be perfect. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from Michael lit up the screen. "Room 305. Can't wait to see you." A thrill ran through her as she started the engine and pulled out of the garage. The drive to the hotel was short, but it felt like an eternity. Her thoughts raced. Excitement, nerves, guilt. Everything swirled together, making her grip the steering wheel tighter. She replayed her earlier conversation with James in her head, his trusting smile as he wished her safe travels. A pang of guilt surfaced, but she quickly pushed it down. Tonight wasn't about guilt. It was about something she had been craving for a long time. When she arrived at the hotel, Martha parked her car and sat for a moment, taking a deep breath. She looked around the lot, reassuring herself that no one she knew would be here. Satisfied, she grabbed her bag and headed for the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. The lobby was quiet, almost serene. She walked quickly, her heels clicking on the marble floor as she made her way to the elevator. Once inside, she pressed the button for the 3rd floor, her nerves tingling with anticipation. The doors slid shut, and she stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls. She looked different, more alive, more vibrant. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped out, her eyes scanning the room numbers until she found 305. She hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over the door handle, before she turned it and pushed the door open. Michael was there, waiting for her. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, that familiar, confident smile on his face. The sight of him made her heart skip a beat. "Hey, beautiful," he whispered, crossing the room in a few quick strides. He pulled her into his arms, and she melted into him, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt. "Hey," Martha breathed, their lips meeting in a hungry kiss. It was as if all the pent-up emotions of the past few weeks had been unleashed in that moment. They clung to each other, the kiss deepening, erasing any remnants of doubt or guilt. Michael pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. "I missed you," he murmured, his voice low and filled with desire. Martha smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I missed you too." They moved together, falling into the rhythm that had become so familiar over the past few months. The hotel room was their sanctuary, a place where the outside world didn't exist, where they could be whoever they wanted to doing this. Michael's lips found hers in a deep, urgent kiss. She responded eagerly, her arms wrapping around his neck as she let herself get lost in the moment. His hands moved over her back, pulling her closer, and she let out a soft sigh as they broke apart, just long enough for him to lead her to the bed. They tumbled onto the bed, a tangle of limbs and laughter. Michael's hands were all over her, pulling at her clothes, touching her in ways that made her forget everything else. Martha surrendered to the passion, the thrill of being wanted, of being desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. Hours passed in a blur. The world outside ceased to exist. The laughter, the whispered secrets, the stolen moments. All of it was a heady mix that left Martha feeling intoxicated, addicted to the man who lay beside her. Every kiss, every touch, every word felt like a rebellion against the life she had back home, a life that felt increasingly distant and irrelevant. As the evening wore on, the two of them lay entwined in the sheets, catching their breath. The hotel room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the encroaching night. Michael's hand traced lazy patterns on Martha's bare back as they talked in hushed tones. "I wish we could stay like this forever," Martha murmured, her head resting on his chest. "Who says we can't?" Michael replied, his voice low and seductive. "You and me, we could run away. Leave everything behind. Start fresh." Martha chuckled softly, though a part of her entertained the thought. "You know, it's not that simple. Doesn't have to be complicated either," Michael said, his fingers gently lifting her chin so she could meet his gaze. "Just think about it. No more pretending, no more hiding. Just us." Martha's heart skipped a beat. The idea was tempting, but reality quickly crept back in. "I have a life, Michael. A marriage, responsibilities. Responsibilities that make you miserable," he countered, his voice turning serious. "I see how you light up when you're with me, how alive you feel. You can't tell me you don't want that all the time." She didn't respond immediately, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She did feel alive with Michael, more than she had in years. But the idea of abandoning her life, her marriage, wasn't something she could do on a whim. "I need time," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael sighed, pulling her closer. "Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm here, waiting." They lay in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation settling over them. Martha closed her eyes, trying to hold on to the fleeting moments of happiness, even as she felt the pull of her other life, the one she'd soon have to return to. Eventually, Martha sat up, glancing at the clock. "I should go. I need to be back before anyone notices I'm gone." Michael sat up beside her, his hand brushing her arm. "You don't have to leave yet. Stay a little longer." She smiled sadly, knowing she couldn't. "I wish I could." She leaned in for one last kiss, a lingering goodbye that left her breathless. She checked her phone when the screen lit up in the nightstand. It was James. Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the notification, her thumb hovering over the screen. What could he possibly be messaging her about this late? She swiped to open the message, and her blood turned to ice. The first thing she saw was a photo. Her breath caught in her throat as she processed the image. James, but he wasn't alone. Sarah, her sister, was in his arms. They were locked in a passionate kiss, the kind of kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. It wasn't just a fleeting peck. It was intense, intimate, almost as if they were savoring each other. Martha's eyes darted to the background of the photo. Her living room, the familiar couch, the family photos on the wall. It was her home. They were in her home, doing this. The disbelief hit her hard, but the words beneath the image hit even harder. "You wanted him? Well, enjoy. I got her. And guess what? You're now a homeless bitch. I'm gonna sleep with your sister." Martha's hands began to shake. She read the message again and again, her mind refusing to comprehend what she was seeing. This couldn't be happening. How had James found out? When had this started with Sarah? How could Sarah do this to her? The questions raced through her mind, but they were quickly overtaken by panic. She jumped out of bed, her movements frantic as she searched for her clothes. She stumbled, nearly tripping over the sheets as she pulled on her pants. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons on her blouse, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "What's the matter?" Michael's voice came. Martha barely looked up, her mind focused on one thing: getting home. "I have to go," she mumbled, grabbing her purse and shoving her phone inside. Michael's smile faltered as he saw the panic on her face. Tell me what's wrong. James, he knows. I have to go, she repeated, her voice shaking now. Michael straightened, the playful tone gone. What do you mean he knows? Martha finally looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. He sent me a picture of him and Sarah. They were in our house, Michael. He knows everything. Michael's face darkened. Shit. Are you sure? I need to go, Martha said again, pushing past him. I have to get home. Michael didn't stop her this time. He watched as she rushed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind her. The gravity of the situation was starting to sink in for both of them. Martha practically ran through the hotel lobby, ignoring the curious glances of the few staff members still on duty. She burst through the front doors and into the cool night air, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her car was parked at the far end of the lot, and she sprinted towards it, her keys already in hand. The drive home was a nightmare. Every red light felt like an eternity, every minute a cruel reminder that James and Sarah were waiting for her. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She kept glancing at her phone, hoping for another message, anything that might explain what the hell was going on. But the screen remained dark, the silence only amplifying her fear. As she pulled onto her street, Martha's heart sank further. Her house looked exactly as it always did, quiet, unassuming. The lights were on in the living room, just as they would be on any other night. But tonight was different. Everything had changed. She parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. She needed to be composed when she walked in, needed to figure out what was happening before she confronted them. But the moment she opened the car door, all thoughts of composure vanished. Martha stormed up to the front door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. She finally managed to unlock it and pushed the door open with more force than necessary. The sight that greeted her nearly brought her to her knees. James and Sarah were sitting on the couch, casually drinking wine as if nothing was amiss. Sarah was wearing one of Martha's robes, the one James had given her for their 25th anniversary. Her sister's hair was still damp from a recent shower, and her feet were propped up on the coffee table, the same spot where Martha usually sat. James looked up as Martha entered, his expression unreadable. "You're home," he said calmly, as if they were simply waiting for her to return from a late night out. Sarah didn't even look at her. She took a sip of wine, her eyes fixed on the TV, which was playing one of Martha's favorite shows. "What the hell is going on here?" Martha demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. James didn't answer immediately. He set his glass down carefully on the table, then stood up, walking over to stand in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and distant. "You think you could lie to me forever, Martha?" he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" "Find out what?" Martha snapped, though she knew exactly what he was talking about. James smirked. "Don't play dumb. I know about you and Michael. I've known for a while." Martha's stomach dropped. "James, I can explain." "Explain," he interrupted, his voice rising. "What's there to explain? You cheated on me. You lied to me. You made me feel like a fool. But don't worry," he added, his tone shifting to something almost gleeful. "I've taken care of everything." Martha glanced over at Sarah, who still hadn't moved or spoken. "Sarah, how could you? And why are you wearing my ring?" Sarah shifted, her lips curling into a smirk as she leaned further into James. "Because, dear sister," she drawled, her voice laced with venom, "James and I have decided that you don't deserve him anymore. So I'm stepping in." Martha felt the air leave her lungs as the room began to spin around her. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself, her legs threatening to give out. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "Whatever this is, just stop it." James rose from the couch, his movements deliberate and slow. He still held Sarah's hand as he approached Martha, his eyes locked on hers. "You threw away 28 years for a fling, Martha," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet rage. "You lied to me. You betrayed me. So, I thought I'd return the favor." The weight of his words hit Martha like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of her. "James, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. We can fix this. We can—" James cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Fix this?" he repeated, shaking his head. "There's nothing to fix, Martha. You broke it. You broke us." Sarah stood up, her hands still clasped in James's as she looked at Martha with a mixture of pity and disdain. "You always thought you were better than me," she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Well, look at you now. You're nothing." Martha's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the couch, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. She had been so careful, so sure that her secret would never come to light. But now, as she sat there, her world crumbling around her, she realized just how blind she had been. James's grip tightened on Sarah's hand as he glanced at the stairs, then back at Martha. "Oh, and by the way," he said, his voice cold and detached, "we've already moved in. You might want to find somewhere else to stay." Martha stared at him in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words. But nothing came out. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, anger, despair. But all she could do was watch as James and Sarah turned and began to ascend the stairs. Each step they took echoed loudly in the silent house, each one a reminder of the life she had lost. As they reached the top, James paused, glancing back at her one last time. "Goodbye, Martha," he said softly, his tone almost pitying. Then he turned away, leading Sarah into the bedroom they had once shared, the bedroom that now belonged to someone else. Martha sat in stunned silence, the tears flowing freely down her cheeks. She could hear the faint sound of laughter from upstairs, a sound that once would have warmed her heart, but now only twisted the knife deeper. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, anything, but she was paralyzed by the crushing weight of her betrayal. She had lost everything: her husband, her sister, her home, and there was no one to blame but herself. The house, once filled with love and warmth, now felt cold and empty. Martha looked around the living room, her eyes lingering on the family photos that lined the walls. The happy faces in the pictures seemed to mock her, a cruel reminder of the life she had destroyed. She thought about leaving, about walking out the door and never looking back. But where would she go? What would she do? The future stretched out before her, bleak and uncertain, and for the first time in her life, Martha felt truly alone. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling as she made her way to the dressing room. Her clothes were thrown haphazardly into open boxes, as if someone had been in a hurry to erase her presence from the room. The sight of her life packed away so carelessly made her chest tighten with a grief that felt almost physical. She forced herself to move forward, each step feeling like it took all the energy she had left. On the floor, something caught her eye. It was a photograph, one of the few remaining pieces of evidence of the life she and James had shared. She recognized it instantly. Their wedding day, a moment captured in time when they had been so full of hope and love. But now, that same photograph had been violently defaced. Their faces were scratched out, deep gouges cutting across the smiles that had once been so genuine. It was as if someone had tried to carve out their very memories from existence. Next to the photograph was a note, the paper crumpled and stained with what she assumed were her own tears from earlier in the day. Martha reached for it with trembling hands, her heart pounding as she read the familiar handwriting. "I loved you once, but now, all I feel is disgust." The words were like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of her. She crumpled to the floor, clutching the photograph and the note to her chest as sobs racked her body. Every breath felt like a struggle, every tear a reminder of the life she had lost. She had betrayed James, but nothing could have prepared her for the depth of his retaliation. This was more than revenge. This was annihilation. Martha didn't know how long she sat there, curled up on the floor, her sobs eventually turning into a hollow, empty silence. Her mind was numb, unable to fully grasp the reality of what had happened. The man she had once loved, the man who had loved her, had gone to such lengths to erase her from his life, to make her feel the full weight of her betrayal. And he had succeeded. As she sat there, her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of laughter from the bedroom. Her heart clenched as she recognized the voices. James and Sarah, the two people who had once been her closest confidants, now laughing together as if she had never existed. Martha's stomach churned and bile rose in her throat. She covered her ears, desperate to block out the sound, but it was no use. The laughter was inescapable, a cruel reminder that her husband had moved on with the one person she never expected to betray her. She felt sick, the nausea rolling over her in waves as the reality of her situation set in. She needed to get out of there, away from the haunting sounds and the sight of her life packed into boxes. But as she stood, her legs shaking beneath her, she realized she had nowhere to go. She was homeless, just as James had so viciously pointed out in his message. The house, once a place of comfort and love, was no longer her home. It was a prison, a place where her worst fears had come to life. The thought of staying, of confronting James and Sarah, was unbearable. She had no fight left in her, no strength to face the brutal reality of what her life had become. The woman who had once been so sure of herself, so confident in her ability to navigate life's challenges, was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. Martha grabbed her car keys, her hands trembling as she clutched them tightly. She had to leave, had to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house before it completely destroyed her. Without looking back, she stumbled out of the front door. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat she had felt inside. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the tears kept coming, blurring her vision as she fumbled to unlock the car. She slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold against her skin, and gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. The streets blurred as she drove aimlessly, the tears falling unchecked as she replayed the events of the past few hours in her mind. How had it come to this? How had she allowed her life to spiral so completely out of control? The answer was simple, and it cut through her like a knife. She had betrayed the man who had loved her unconditionally, and now she was paying the price. As she drove through the darkened streets, Martha couldn't stop thinking about the depths of James's revenge. It wasn't just about him and Sarah. It was about completely destroying her, taking everything she had left. And he had succeeded. Martha sat on the edge of the lumpy bed in the dimly lit motel room, staring blankly at the cracked wallpaper. The days had blurred together since she fled the house, each one passing in a fog of numbness and regret. The cheap room reeked of stale cigarettes and despair, a fitting backdrop for the wreckage of her life. She couldn't bring herself to call anyone. What would she say? How could she explain what had happened? The phone remained silent, that James had not tried to contact her. Not a single message, not a single call. The silence from him was deafening, more painful than any confrontation could have been. It was as if she no longer existed to him, as if she had been erased from his life just as thoroughly as her presence had been erased from their home. She thought about calling her friends, but what could she say? That she had thrown away 28 years of marriage for a man who wasn't her husband? That she had lied and deceived, and now was paying the price for her betrayal? Martha imagined what her friends would think if they knew the truth. They had always envied her marriage, the way James adored her, the way they seemed so perfect together. But now, that perfect image had shattered, and Martha was left with nothing but the shards of her broken life. The loneliness was suffocating. Her lover also dumped her. She tried to distract herself with television, but the inane chatter of sitcoms only made her feel more isolated. She couldn't even bring herself to eat, the thought of food making her stomach turn. Sleep was elusive. The few hours she managed to catch haunted by nightmares of James and Sarah together, laughing at her, mocking her for her foolishness. Each day, she contemplated going back, facing James and begging for forgiveness. But deep down, she knew it was pointless. The damage was irreparable, the trust shattered beyond repair. Even if James were willing to forgive her, she couldn't forgive herself. She had destroyed the life they had built together, and there was no going back to the way things were. One evening, as the sun set behind the dingy curtains of the motel room, Martha decided to leave. She couldn't stay there any longer, wallowing in her own misery. But she had no destination in mind, no place to go. The life she had known was gone, and with it, any sense of purpose or direction. She packed the few belongings she had brought with her, clothes hastily stuffed into a duffel bag, her phone charger, the last remnants of the life she had left behind. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, wondering if she should call James one last time. But what would she say? That she was sorry? That she wanted to come home? The words seemed meaningless, empty in the face of what had happened. With a heavy heart, Martha opened the door and stepped into the fading light. The cool evening air hit her face, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the motel room. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the weight of her actions pressed down on her like a physical burden. She walked to her car, each step feeling like it took all her remaining strength. As she drove away, the motel disappearing in the rearview mirror, Martha realized she had no idea where she was going. She was lost, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, and she had no map to guide her. But as she drove, a small part of her knew that she couldn't keep running forever. At some point, she would have to stop, to face the consequences of her actions, to try and rebuild her life from the ruins. But for now, all she could do was drive, hoping that somewhere, somehow, she would find a way to start over.